In my first talk, I took a general look at carbon pricing and how it works. In this talk, I look more closely at different mechanisms for pricing carbon in practice. The simplest way to impose a price on carbon dioxide emissions is to put in place a tax payable on each tonne of emissions. This is the approach adopted in many jurisdictions around the world, for example France, Sweden, Chile, British Columbia and the UK. However, which emissions are taxed and at what rate varies a lot between systems. For example, in 2017, in Chile, only large emitters such as power plants and large industrial facilities were taxed at a rate of $5 per tonne, a rather low level. In contrast, in British Columbia, the tax was $30 per tonne on almost all emissions from combustion. The other common way of pricing carbon is an emissions trading system. This is most commonly in the form of a cap and trade system. The idea here is that the regulatory authorities place a limit or cap on total emissions. This is done by imposing a requirement that every tonne of emissions must be accompanied by an allowance, essentially a certificate allowing 1 tonne of emissions. So, for example, if you emit 1 million tonnes, you will be required to submit 1 million allowances to cover them. Only a limited number of allowances are issued, say 100 million allowances, and this in turn limits total emissions to, say, 100 million tonnes. If the cap is below where emissions would otherwise be, then allowances become scarce, and emitters will pay to acquire them. Allowances can be bought and sold, hence the trade in the term cap and trade. The need to buy allowances sets the carbon price. This type of system is again used around the world, and indeed accounts for the majority of carbon pricing. It's been introduced in the EU, China, South Korea, California, Ontario and elsewhere. In many ways, carbon taxes and emissions trading are similar in that they both put a price on emissions and by doing so incentivize emissions reductions. In both cases, those emitters that can reduce emissions at a cost per tonne below the carbon price will be financially better off if they do so. For example, if the price of allowances is $30 a tonne and an industrial facility can reduce emissions at a cost of $20 per tonne by increasing energy efficiency, it will be able to save $10 per tonne by doing so rather than buying the allowances. And both approaches to carbon pricing are better than not pricing carbon. However, there are differences which turn out to have considerable practical importance. We can see the difference very clearly if we plot the two approaches on a conventional supply and demand diagram. On the vertical axis we have the price of emissions in dollars per tonne, and on the horizontal axis we have tonnes of emissions. We can represent the supply of emissions with a cap and trade system as a vertical line. There is a fixed quantity of emissions allowed, which is set by the number of allowances issued, and this does not vary whatever the price. In contrast, a tax gives the same price whatever the quantity of emissions, and so is represented by a horizontal line. Demand for emissions, which is essentially demand to be able to use the atmosphere to dispose of carbon dioxide, decreases as price increases. With the price at zero, demand will be whatever the level of emissions is in the absence of carbon pricing. As the price of emissions increases, more and more emitters will find it cheaper to reduce their emissions than pay the price. So the demand for emissions will decrease. If we knew in advance the cost of reducing emissions, we could reach the same point either with a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, simply by putting the price or the quantity limit at the appropriate level. I've marked this on the chart here with a stylized demand curve for emissions. That is how much emitters are willing to pay for a certain level of emissions. However, in practice we don't know what demand for emissions will be. It might be lower or higher than we expect. As a result, under a cap and trade system, the price may be lower or higher than expected. With a tax, it's the quantity of emissions that may be higher or lower than expected. Each of these can be a problem. If prices are too high, this may result in higher prices for consumers, which may be a concern for governments. If the quantity of emissions is too large, this may endanger policy targets and ultimately the climate. Both approaches differ from most markets where price varies with quantity. There are very few markets with completely fixed supply like an emissions trading system. One example is major sporting events which have a fixed number of tickets. So, for example, there are only so many seats on centre court for the final of the Wimbledon tennis tournament. Another example is genuine paintings by deceased artists. However, there are almost no others. Although clearly the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb emissions is ultimately fixed. Similarly, very few markets have a price which is the same irrespective of demand in the way a carbon tax is. To make carbon pricing systems more like a normal market, it is possible to introduce a cap and trade system where supply varies in response to price. This type of mechanism is found in the Western Climate Initiative systems, that is California, Quebec and Ontario, and also in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the northeastern United States. In these systems, a lower price boundary is imposed by putting in place an auction reserve price, just as in an art auction or on eBay. Allowances are not sold below the reserve price. This reserve price escalates over time at a predefined rate to create stronger signals for investment. While the market price can drop below the reserve price for a while, so such a mechanism is sometimes referred to as a soft floor, it is unlikely to do so for very long if there is confidence that the system will continue, especially if the floor price will continue to escalate. Here's the market price and the auction reserve price in California since shortly after the system began. You can see that prices generally remained above the reserve price. The exception was a short period in 2016, which illustrates the soft nature of the floor. These lower prices were the result of political and legal uncertainty about the future of the system. There are other ways of imposing a price floor. One is to put in a tax in addition to a cap and trade system, as in the UK power sector, which I covered in my last talk. The tax is the lowest level to which the price can fall, even if the allowance price is zero. Another, which is closer to the original intention of the UK tax, is a top-up fee, which adds to the price in the event that it falls below the floor. So, for example, with a floor price of $30 per tonne, if the allowance price is $25 per tonne, a top-up payment of $5 per tonne will be payable. If the allowance price is $30 or above per tonne, then no fee is payable. If the price goes high, a price ceiling can be imposed if allowances are released from a reserve to help moderate the price. There may be a number of different price thresholds at which this can be done. Under the California system at present, there are 3 thresholds. The total number of additional allowances is fixed, so the price will continue to increase once these are exhausted, giving a soft ceiling. However, after 2020, new provisions in California appear likely to be introduced to give additional supply at high prices, so the price will ultimately be limited by a harder ceiling, with prices not going above those levels. With the current provisions in place, the supply curve for allowances in the California system then looks like this. I'm ignoring here the complications caused by the ability to hold allowances for future use, or to use allowances not used up in previous periods, which is often called banking of allowances. There is some supply at a price of zero because some allowances are allocated free of charge. More allowances are at the auction reserve price. Supply is then fixed until the price reaches the level at which additional allowances are released from a price containment reserve. Once the reserve is exhausted, the price can go higher, at least until a further ceiling is introduced. It's worth noting that to secure the full environmental benefits of a floor price, and a reserve to contain high prices, it's essential that unused allowances are cancelled over time so that the cumulative emissions cap is reduced. There are a few other variants of cap and trade. For example, an intensity-based system scales the cap with levels of industrial output so that emissions intensity, that is, emissions per unit of output, is limited. Another variant is a baseline and credit system where allowances are granted to emitters if emissions are below a baseline and must be purchased for emissions above a baseline. However, this is, in practice, very similar to a cap and trade system where allowances are issued free of charge at the baseline level. So, what are the relative advantages of taxes and cap and trade systems? A cap and trade system has the advantage that it firmly limits the quantity of emissions. This can be made consistent with limiting the total cumulative emissions over time globally to reach agreed temperature targets, although individual jurisdictions over limited time horizons will often be a small proportion of this total. It is also consistent with the international policy architecture, which works in terms of limiting quantities. Indeed, individual countries must set out plans indicating how much they intend to reduce their emissions. There is a natural fit between such quantity limits and the characteristics of climate change, where damages are likely to get much greater if the world passes certain limits on total cumulative emissions. Related to this, a cap can give investors a powerful strategic signal that emissions must come down over time. This in turn can stimulate companies to make the necessary investments. Finally, a cap can more effectively reflect ethical choices about the level of climate change and associated risks a jurisdiction wishes to accept. However, a cap also has disadvantages. Supply is rigidly fixed, so prices can be very volatile. They can also drop to below levels needed to stimulate efficient abatement, as we have seen, for example, in the EU emissions trading system from 2012 to 2017. Furthermore, there is no incentive to go beyond the cap. Once the cap is being achieved, prices will drop in principle to zero, although in practice the price will usually be supported by the future value of allowances. In contrast, a tax can provide stable signals to investors. While a tax has the drawback that the quantity of emissions is uncertain, the price can be adjusted over time to reach quantity targets. It also provides consistent incentives to reduce emissions, so avoiding the problem of inadequate prices found under some emissions trading systems. It also seems easier to set adequate levels of prices in at least some carbon pricing systems, in that higher carbon prices around the world are generally taxes, as illustrated in the chart which I included in my previous talk. A tax is also simpler to administer, usually being highly compatible with existing systems of reporting and taxation. However, as experience in California and elsewhere has shown, rather than being stark alternatives, cap and trade and taxes are more like alternative ends of a spectrum of possibilities. In many ways, the best solution is a combination of limits on quantities and limits on prices in a hybrid system like that in California. A quantity limit can help ensure that the system meets its environmental objectives, while a price floor can capture many of the advantages of a tax, provided the price floor is set at an adequate level. There is also a case for a reserve of allowances only released when prices reach a certain level to impose a soft ceiling, though once the reserve is exhausted, it is desirable, for reasons of environmental integrity, not to exceed the cap. So, in conclusion, both cap and trade systems and taxes have advantages. The best solution in most cases is likely to be a cap and trade system with a floor price and perhaps a soft ceiling. The main caveats are that the floor price needs to be set at an adequate level if the advantages are to be realised, and that unsold allowances from reserves must be cancelled over time to secure environmental benefits. Thanks for watching. Further details, including a transcript of this talk and accompanying slides, are available on my website www.onclimatechangepolicy.org.